Morning, Cy. Thanks for joining. I appreciate you on short notice being flexible and able to sit down, have I won't call it a fireside chat because there's no fire, but a nice quarantine chat, we can call it, right? In today's ever
Indeed.
changing world of working remote. Um, I know you and I have been working together the last couple weeks as all this CARES Act has come out and bouncing ideas off of each other. And I know you're getting peppered with questions, and I'm probably sending most of them to you that I get, and back and forth. So I thought it'd be a great use of our time to leverage our respective knowledge bases and just get this uh, webinar together to provide to clients and other people out in the community of who are in the government contracting industry, because as you know, it is a very nuanced and complex industry, and we're getting peppered with all kinds of questions. So, I think the format of this is just an open dialogue. We'll go through the questions that we've been getting, and again, I think the caveat's going to be all of this is it depends and could be changing at the drop of a hat as soon as new guidance comes out. So, I'm just going to start with the first one that's really become first and foremost with my clients that are government contractors is, all right, PPP loans. I've applied. I'm either about to get the money or I've gotten the money. Do I keep it? Given the Treasury guidance through Fact 31, as well as recent press that I'm sure you can elaborate on, what should our government contractor industry clients consider, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and we've gotten the same question from a lot of people. And I think the main thing folks are worried about, I think, is the needs certification. Now, obviously, you've got people who might have done things from an affiliation perspective, which I think is something they're going to look at. But if you're covered on the affiliation question and the size question, really it's this need certification that's causing the confusion.
Mm-hmm.
And the Treasury guidance that you mentioned came out and said, well, it at least insinuated that if you had access to cash on hand or retained earnings, or if you had access to a line of credit, then you should tap that to some extent. But before you can really make a need certification for PPP. It like you said, it's not entirely clear where that line is. I know some folks who really have tapped their line of credit fully and have expended all cash on hand. I don't think that's actually necessary to make the need certification, though. I think if you're in a situation where you have proper documentation at the time you applied for the loan. So if that was a month ago and you were in the first sort of tranche, or if you're doing it now, document what you see out there as far as economic uncertainty for your own business. But I think it's also worth it to document things in the industry generally. And I've been telling people just from like the legal perspective, right? If you look at from like lawyers and law firms, there's a ton of things on the internet that shows like catastrophic layoffs, cuts in pay, all kinds of things like that. So I just have been paying attention to that. And so that's just an example. So if you have something in your industry where you go online and you just see news stories about massive cuts or layoffs or something like that, and tumultuous futures potentially, document that.
Yeah.
Use anything like that to help you cover your need assessment, not just your own company. Of course, if there's things for your own company where you've actually had contracts shut down and you're going to the second tranche of PPP and you're actually getting hurt, or your April revenues were way down, even better, right? At least for purposes of getting the loan.
Yeah. So as I put in an email to my clients, I say it is absolutely a facts and circumstances situation. So it's not going to be one big general answer. So everyone has to have great documentation, have a system that they can track what's been happening to their contract, their backlog, communications with contracting officers, on site, what are they able to do? And it really comes down to, you better have the paperwork to support, an audit. Because, I've read the recent news, I guess, is it Elizabeth Warren is going to put a task force together, and there'll be FOIA requests, and, at least for funds of 2 million or more. And I don't think any one of my clients wants to be up in front of Congress in an oversight committee hearing trying to explain why, as a government contractor, they received a $2 million plus loan, or maybe even less, but yet didn't lose any contracts, or only had a few people off the contracts. And, so that's, I've been a little bit more strong in my recommendations. Some of my clients have decided to return the money or rescind the loan process. Those are ones that have PE backing. They're flush with cash, and they really saw that economic uncertainty clause in there, and like, well, everyone's a little bit uncertain now. So, but the act did have Section 3610 addressed to government contractors specifically, and that's where I pointed my clients to immediately. I'm like, hey, look, there's a clause in there right there for you. Are you reaching out to your contracting officers and customers to find out, are they willing to fund you? What are you seeing in that respect of how successful has that been? And I know it's going to be anecdotal, but I've heard mixed responses on how that's worked.
Yeah, I've seen things all over the map as well, just with our clients. A number of them are still in the negotiation phase. Some of them that were really early on, I know some Navy contractors and whatnot, they just turned the contracts back on as far as funding, not the work.
Right.
And just started paying people, even on firm fixed price contracts, just kept paying.
Wow.
That was sort of before any of the guidance came out. After that, I've seen a lot more negotiations and asking for cost buildups and that sort of thing, refusing to pay profits, which arguably the law itself doesn't put restrictions. It says minimum applicable rates under the contract, which would include everything, which would include profit, overhead, G&A, you name it. But now they're modding contracts to add this. It's not a FAR clause, it's just a clause that they're adding in there about having to do cost buildups or show your costs, or it's only the amounts that you're actually paying people. Maybe there's some G&A that should be included and overhead. But I'm seeing more and more of the contracting officers really negotiating that.
Yeah.
One thing really quickly too that I just heard today is that one of the intel agencies put out guidance to their contractors saying you can't apply for 3610 unless you've either tried to get PPP and were denied, or you've documented why you're not eligible to apply for PPP, and we want to see it, which is interesting.
That is very interesting. Again, it's ever changing. So to me, that's a real game changer, because if you go, well, we didn't feel like we qualified for PPP loan because we do have access to a line. And so I could see the contracting officers going, well, then that's what you're going to do. And we're not even going to give you 3610 funding. So that's going to be real interesting. So they put that in there, and then they say, well, if you weren't eligible for PPP, you're not going to be eligible for 3610. So yeah, this is going to be, well, I'm sure the attorneys will be very busy. And on the after fact, right?
Yeah, and it's that in particular, that new issue is very odd because it's the government agencies saying we don't want to spend our money,
Right.
Go get PPP funding, where then the PPP auditors are saying, no, you got to go find some other source, but we're the last resort.
Right.
Well, which is it?
Yeah, one of them wants to be last resort. They both can't be last resort, and then it's well, yeah, I guess that's to be determined or later, and I guess that'll be an agency by agency. But if one's doing it, I imagine others will follow suit.
Mm-hmm.
So, I have one client that I don't think they had any loss of significance, but they are looking at the funds they have been noticed that there's going to be a big stop work order. Some questions have come up is, well, what about FAR and cost allocations and rates? So what have you looked into, or what have you seen, at least for now, what could be potentially happen on that with regards to the rates? And I can add some insight as myself, but have you seen anything specific come out of DCAA on this?
I know that certain folks have been talking with DCAA to try to get some additional guidance out of them. I think my general understanding is that, look, if you've got cost reimbursable work, then there's a couple ways I guess it could be implicated. One, like your indirect costs, you won't have them if you get forgiven, at least a tranche of it, right? That you've used with loans. So you can't, it's actual cost. That's another thing that I think the government gets confused, and contractors. Like, G&A is not profit. It's not just extra money. It's actual costs.
Yes.
Right. And if you don't have those costs, the contractor can't continue to build up their G&A with those costs because they're phantom. They don't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And so that's part of it. And then also the idea of actually having to reimburse for certain types of contractors, which we'll get into in a second, having to actually pay the government back if you do get forgiven. Yeah.
Because I have, most of my clients are not CAS covered, but I do have CAS covered clients. And I have seen that if you're CAS covered, you have to give a credit back to the government. So if you have, vendor refunds or anything of that nature, and I've seen guidance that this PPP loan forgiveness would be a credit that would go back. And that makes sense to me, because basically you're getting funded through taxpayer dollars on a cost reimbursable. If you're getting money from the government that's getting forgiven, they're not going to, let you eat at the trough twice, right? They're going to make you pay it back. Now, what that does, though, is you've got to model these rates. And then when do you pay it back? Well, it's going to be on contract closeout, and who knows how long that can be. So those are other things that I don't know if you've heard, is like, will they try to expedite a contract closeout by, what will they try to do to maybe do this? Or is that that could be something hanging down the road that they're going to have to model for or plan for? But that's one thing I'm looking at and doing in the future, next week or two, is as we get more guidance. And I'm working with some former DCA reps that work for a colleague of mine, to model what is this going to look like on rates if they push this CAS covered requirements to all companies, right? And to your point, if you're on a cost plus contract, it might come down to that. Now it's going to get spread out. So then it comes down to, can they reach into the FFPs or T&Ms? I don't see that happening, but you never know. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and that's where we've had some clients, I think, who are confused with when the government is entitled to refunds on firm fixed price. And because of that, they're worried about it over here. And generally what we've seen is, if the firm fixed price contract has a specific number of hours or FTEs and you don't provide it, yes, the government's going to ask for a refund. But then, because that's a contractual issue, whereas this is just a cost savings. So I think you're right. I think there's good arguments that from a firm fixed price perspective, the government's not entitled to the refund. It's just like if you found somebody and were able to pay them $50,000 less or something like that.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. I don't know. Are there any things? I know we had a long list, but what's the probably top 3 things that's concerning you the most, or what you think the government contractors should focus on, besides obviously documenting the uncertainty? Throw that out there to you.
Yeah, I think kind of the thing that keeps coming up, that is what we were talking about, is the idea of the forgiveness, or should I go get forgiveness? Am I going to have to pay something back to the government? What if I don't seek forgiveness? Can I take these funds and just use them for whatever I want? And I think you have to go back to the original certification. And it wasn't just need. I know we talked about need, but aside from need, there was also a certification that you were going to use this to pay payroll. and to pay the covered expenses like covered utilities, covered rent, covered mortgage. And now you're not doing that any longer. And if you had an intention at the beginning, especially if there were emails or something like that, because if you get audited or worst case, they give you a subpoena or something, and they look at your emails and your records, if you have emails where you're going back and forth and be like, this is great, this is free money, we got to get this, that's a bad email.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely.
and you don't, that's the type of people you should definitely think about just repaying this by the 7th. If
Yeah.
it ended up you didn't need it and you have bad emails and information like that, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'll to add on to that, because most of my clients are pass-through companies, right? They're S corps or partnerships, mainly S corporations, right? So the taxes, distributions are all passed through up to the owners, and that was a big question I had from the get-go, is like, how do you segregate your funds if you get this PPP loan, it gets forgiven, and you don't pay payroll that covers it all up, or you do and then you don't tap into your line, and then you take out distributions, because you had this money that let you build up your cash account for other needs. So that I strongly recommend that not happen, that there that my clients have documentation to show they did not use PPP loans to pay the owners distributions and to take profits out of the company, for sure. So I have recommended that, set up a separate GL account, not just for the PPP loan, but for the 3610 funding when it comes in, so you can truly track, and then set up a separate bank account, really show how it's being done, and that it's going to be tricky, but they're going to have to keep track of that, how those costs are being allocated, and that's going to be for FAR purposes anyway. But really, they can't just do this on the fly. They got to have good or excellent detailed records, because anything can be scrutinized after the fact.
Yeah, and it goes back to what you really intended for the horrible things like the False Claims Act or something like that. That's where those emails are so bad, because you can get hit with worse penalties. Yeah. But even when you're looking at, and this is something we didn't really touch on a second ago with need, is I've had some clients ask too about, well, is the need like now, or is the need, because I see uncertainty in the next 2 years while this is amortized, this loan is going to amortize over 2 years. So I see this and I've got these risks that I'm taking into account. And the way the law is written is it's as of the date of the application.
Right.
So I don't think you can just look into 2 years into the future, because then I don't know, everybody can say that.
Exactly. And I think they use that economic uncertainty down the road to apply for this. But then there were the companies like one of my non-GovCon companies that literally overnight their revenues dropped to almost nothing, because they served the hospitality and restaurant world. And when they're not buying, you're not selling, and their revenue dropped, I think, to 1% of budget. So they immediately got in. They got the PPP loan. So I have no doubts whatsoever that they met that need.
Right.
So they're going to be fine. Now what they're trying to figure out, and I think this goes to any government contractor, if they had a big loss of contracts, weren't able to get 3610, do you go for forgiveness? Do you try to keep people when you don't need them? And then all of a sudden you run out, and now you're still out of funds, and now you're still off the contracts because it does get extended. What do you do? So we're having those discussions to talk about the modeling of maybe forgiveness isn't the right way to go right now. It's keep the loan, keep the funds, so that when you can rehire or you get the contracts back up and running, you have that access. Yes, you'll have to pay it back, but it's at a very nice low rate.
Yeah, and that's the other thing we've been talking about with folks as well, is the auditing, because I know it's so up in the air because there wasn't an auditing provision put in the law or anything. It's pretty much based off of Mnuchin press release, right?
Yeah, right. After the fact, right?
Right. And so I think people are like, well, what is it going to look like? What are they going to look at? And the honest answer is nobody knows. It might just be bluster. It might be a combination of both that and they're going to look at egregious circumstances. But it's a good bet that they're going to look at you, at least if you got over that $2 million amount in your loans, and they're going to want to see what you put together. And I think for certain clients, especially in the GovCon space, if you didn't lose anything, we have just a feeling like they're going to put something in the forgiveness application that's going to look at whether or not you actually lost revenues or something to that effect to ensure that the forgiveness is only given to certain people. And if you keep it, I would still make sure you're using it for the purposes that you certified to. So there's no question that your actions now can somehow be looked at by DOJ or whoever as to what your intent was.
Right. No, that absolutely makes sense. It's like anything, whether they're getting an incurred cost proposal audited, it's all about the records. It's all about the documentation. And, hopefully the audit doesn't go down to below 2 million. My guess is it might, and thoughts are with government contracting world, they do get their incurred cost proposals audited. So if they are submitting them, I could see, somebody down the road saying, well, let's just add this process into that submission and let's look at that and request those documents. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I could see it happening. I mean, do you think that could be a possibility?
Yeah, and that's where I do think there's going to be something like that. And it either through that process or on other contracts, or there's going to be potentially some FAR clause put in there down the road.
Right.
That's going to just for 10 years from now, it's going to keep happening where there's going to be some certification that people made that they didn't use PPP funding like improperly or something, some way to get companies certifying to something so they can then come back later and make a claim.
Yeah. It's definitely, it's as always, the GovCon industry is unique, always will be. And this just adds a whole nother level of complexities. Ideally, we get back to work and get back to normalcy. So the sooner rather than later, but if it does drag out, I can see all of a sudden, future budgetary cuts and spending and massive reductions. Then what happens? I mean, have you heard anything about, could they then go in for this second tranche that just got released? I mean, is that something that they should be considering now that maybe they've had some guidance from the contracting officers? They're hearing, about certain cuts. But I mean, right now, looks like the government's willing to just print money and get money out there. But as we all know, that can't continue. At least you wouldn't think it could. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting because with the, at least the current administration has not been so hawkish as far as the budget issues have been concerned.
Right.
Like McConnell and some of the other folks have said, we got to be real careful with this going forward. We can't just keep doing this forever, which is true. But to a certain extent, like you said, they have just been sort of intent to print money, and frankly, it's probably been the last almost 40 years that they've just been doing that. So who knows how much longer that will continue. I think at some point there's going to be a level of austerity. I don't really see it happening in the near future.
Right.
But it's certainly a potential risk. And what I have seen though is contracting officers and like this guidance we talked about earlier, really trying to protect their budgets or saying, I don't have the money for this, even though for 3610, it said it can come from any act. So it's any bucket of money that any agency has, they can use, but they're telling people we don't have any, especially places like the State Department who have been cut, or there's been a lot of proposed cuts, at least by this particular administration for that agency. And they're saying like, we don't have it. So we're not gonna pay you.
Yeah, that's the other thing I've been seeing, and what clients have come to me with is, depends on what agency. Are they DOD, and what agency within DOD versus civilian, and then what is civilian? So to your point, State Department or EPA or DOEs. Obviously those agencies that are not in favor with the current administration have been seeing cuts, and so I think again it's going to be facts and circumstances. I also recommend that, look, they did sequestration, say that 3 times. I could see that down the road, some sort of similar forced budget across the board, but probably not within a year or so, but definitely 2 to 3 years. So look, I always say, don't just look at the short term, look at the long term. What do you want to do to succeed? They should be prepared for some sort of austerity, I would say within the next 3 to 5 years, at least, if not a little sooner. But for now, the current needs are, do they get PPP loan money? If they do, how much is forgivable, if any? And 3, how do they, comply with FAR, CAS, and all that fun stuff? So is where we're at. What are some other legal aspects that you're seeing that they need to consider? This not quote accounting, but just kind of from a legal perspective.
I think another thing that's come up is mixing. Like if I have PPP funds, and can I apply for 3610 if I have the funds for this, but some of my contracts aren't shut down, other ones are. Or I've even had questions where folks have said, well, I got 3610, but the government is negotiating really hard and they're refusing to pay me other things that should arguably under the law be allowable. Can I use the PPP funds to cover that delta? And I think what the answer is, as far as generally mixing, there's nothing that says you can't. And this other guidance I read today from some of the intel agencies expressly said, if you have PPP over here, you can use it. To the extent that PPP isn't enough to cover you, you can come then talk to us for 3610 funding. And in the reverse question, where I got 3610, but they're really negotiating hard and they're not paying all my costs, as long as it falls into those other tranches of money, it's actually payroll as defined in the act or other things, you could use the PPP funds to pay for that. But you can't use it for things like profit, right? Which is what people have been asking. Like the 3610, they're cutting all my profit and now I have no money to live on. What do I do? And I don't think you can use PPP funds directly for that. But what is interesting is in some of the guidance that came out like a week or 2 ago, I know time seems to have no meaning anymore, but at some point, this guidance came out a short while ago that suggested that certain pass-through income to owners and things could be covered by PPP, like your K1s.
Right.
But remember, even if you're going to take that interpretation, it's up to $100,000 annualized. So it's 4,000 something, right? Of pay period. And that's
it.
Can't do
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that is interesting. Right. Because the government thinks no one should have profits, or at least some people in the government. and then, okay, if we don't have profits, what do you do? And then what about unallowables? There are still certain things you have to do as a business that are quote unallowable, but again, that's a cost that hits the bottom line. So that has to come out of profits. So it's definitely going to be critical. And I'm probably repeating myself that they've got to have a system in place where they're truly tracking it. But I don't know how you can say, oh, I got this dollar and it's being spent towards payroll costs, but this dollar in my operating account is spent for my profit. So the only thing I can think of is have that separate bank account, right? Show a flow of funds, say, okay, here's my 3610 bank account, here's my PPP loan bank account, and of course who wins in this banks, and they charge you for the fees for each account. And then you do your expenditures and you allocate them out. That's the only thing I can think that would maybe show you're spending that money and that you don't have a big account, pot of gold sitting in your operating account, that you're needing these to fund things. And then once you get to normalcy, you're able to rebuild back that operating account. But to me, I think that's going to be their best option to show, or best documentation to show how these things are flowing. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think it does make sense and the confusion I think that's come up too at this point is the idea that the law, people have read the law or looked at guidance or blogs or we talked to them, what, God, when did this come out? A month ago, 5 weeks
Yeah,
ago?
about a month ago,
Right?
I was looking at emails.
Yeah, and we said this is what the law says, right? But that was before any of this guidance drilled down on it, right?
Right.
And now the law doesn't say anything about double dipping except for FFCRA, the
Right.
Leave Act stuff.
Yep.
So you could take the loans, get it forgiven, and see zero drop in revenue, and that would just double your profit or whatever it does to your profit. And under the law, there's nothing that says that's improper, but given everything that's come out, I don't think they're going to let that stand. So
No.
to your point, you got to segregate it and show it. And if you made out like a bandit, they're probably going to deny the forgiveness. And I could see them also question whether or not your initial certification was accurate. So you got to have really good documentation and probably not ask for forgiveness. I don't know if you need to rush to repay by the 7th, that safe harbor. If you do see some reason or if you have documentation of need, but if you bent over backwards to change your corporate structure or something like that with gray area changes, those are the people who I think it's more important to probably think about paying it back for the 7th.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's the key, right? Is who I know we're 6 days out from the 7th. So it is going to be some very big decision making on their part. Some have already gotten the money, some are about to get the money, and what do they do? And I think that's huge. It comes down to, like we said back to the beginning, did they have a need and immediate need? So they're going to have to really show that, yeah, within a week we were kicked off as soon as the quarantining started, or even earlier than that, when some agencies must have had an idea of what was coming. They already started taking measures. I've got a client that they were impacted before March 16th or 17th when a lot of the schools shut down. So they're struggling with the fact that they actually got hit earlier, and then all of a sudden OMB came out with the guidance that you can start with March 27th. So what are you seeing to help fill that gap? Will the PPP loan fill that gap?
Yeah, I mean, arguably the COs, the guidance is just guidance. So that's the sort of interesting part is I think a lot of the COs are confused because there's nothing in the FAR, right? And their training is so FAR based that they can't break out of that sometimes. But they have pretty much plenary authority to do what they want on this if they have the gusto or whatever to do that.
Right.
And the law says as long as you're shut down due to COVID and the declaration that was made in January by the president, then you should be covered. So I think there's arguments to go back to the contracting officers and say, no, fine, you're citing this guidance that's not binding to you. And by the way, it's a misunderstanding of the law, and here's why.
Right.
If they're willing to work with you, they would certainly be covered. Now, they're very risk averse. So,
but again, they have plenary authority, so they could go back and say, well, great, but we're going with this date because that's the guidance that came out. So, but what about? Yeah.
So yeah, you just use PPP because those sort of fundings would be available from it's the date of the act, and then sort of going forward, you could use the funds. So that's the confusion though, because the date of the act I think was the 27th. So when you get the funding, you could use it from the February 15th to June 30th. So there's some period of time where you could use some of the funds for that.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing is, I mean, that's lost revenue back then, so they had to probably dip near their line to pay. So most likely they're going to have to, use that funds to pay whatever line they did draw down on before this even came out as a thing. So, Yeah, I see this being problematic, but I think they have a good case for documenting a PPP loan and forgiveness. Another situation is, let's say, contractor, they're a sub, they're not prime, it's their biggest contract, and the prime has been notified, can't do the work. Prime really it wasn't eligible for PPP loan, and for their, client customer relationship, they're not willing to go even ask for 3610. What recourse, if any, other than PPP is there for that subcontractor? I mean, can they go direct? Can they jump the prime to ask for their 3610? Can you address that a little bit?
So that could be tricky because you don't have any sort of privity of contract with the government, so you don't have really authority to ask for it directly. However, if your subcontract has a provision in it that requires the prime to sponsor a claim or an REA in there, which is a pretty common clause, then you could use that, especially if it's obligatory, right? If it requires the prime to do this, then you could put together what's essentially an REA package, but under 3610, and submit it through to them and say, here, under this clause, you're required to pass this through to the government. And if they don't, arguably it's a breach of contract on the prime's perspective, depending on what the clause says in your subcontract.
Right. Could you see any issue where they don't want to upset the contractor? So they're like, well, we definitely need the PPP loans. We want to keep these people employed so that when we are able to get back on site, we're not having to rehire, which they'll probably still be available, but maybe they don't. I don't know. Maybe they're making enough off the unemployment to start out that they don't have to immediately jump back on. But what are your thoughts on, could they then get deemed, well, you should have gone for 3610? You think there's less risk to the subcontractor in that respect, or should they at least try? I recommended they at least contact their core contracting officer at the prime, talk about 3610. Is there an option in the contract to do the REA, and then see where that goes? But I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Because frankly, 3610 is a better deal potentially, depending on what gets negotiated,
Right.
than the PPP funds, because you can use it for different things. It can actually pay all your costs. So that's certainly a best way to go. And it's not limited or capped or anything.
Right. Yeah, so there's not limits. Yeah. And the other thing, with regards to PPP loan, obviously that has the 500 employee and other eligibility restrictions. With the 3610, just to confirm, that is eligible for all government contractors. There is no limit, correct?
Right. You just have to be shut down because of COVID after that, the emergency declaration, and not be able to telework.
Gotcha. So even the bigs could go and ask for that money if they have a significant number of people off a contract, right? Okay.
Yeah, and it even says your subcontractors are listed in there. And I have seen, for what it's worth, some of the bigs and some of the M&O contractors also that run the DOE sites creating what looks like a FAR clause but isn't, that they're just flowing down. That's a 3610 clause in particular, and they're modifying contracts. I've only seen the past couple of days. Maybe last week. No, I think it's been this week.
They're actually going mods referencing the 3610 specifically. Yep. That's interesting.
So I would ask about that too, because it's certainly happened.
Oh, absolutely. I know we'll continue to keep doing webinars. I am talking with other experts, as I mentioned, former DCAA. It will be important for government contractors to start developing a model of how they're going to handle this, rates. There's just going to be a lot of fluidity in this for sure. Whether they're on prime, whether they're sub for the most part. Yeah, it's going to be interesting, but clearly I'll be getting you involved as best I can with any of them. What would you, what are some best practices are you thinking right now besides the documentation? But like, what resources besides yourself or CPA are you seeing that could be helpful to your clients?
So any of the particular guidance from the agencies, even if it's not something that applies directly to the agency you're working for, because the civilian agencies, other than the OMB memo, which is universal, the
Right.
civilian agencies, I just haven't seen, at least no one's passed it along, any guidance really coming from them. It's all DoD and the Intel side, and they're all over it.
You're right.
They've been issuing guidance and modifying things left and right. So I think paying attention to all of that and taking it in as best practices or what the general opinion is of the government is right now, I think is a solid thing to do, and it certainly gives you coverage. And then obviously document that that yeah, I looked at this and this is where I came with this
Yeah.
interpretation.
Yeah, even if your conclusion might not been the exact conclusion someone to reach, at least you can document how you reached the conclusion, the guidance you went by, and that the intent was obviously to use these funds for the good of the employee base and the good of, and to keep the company running. And to your point, not, hey, here's found money, woo, have an email that we should be doing this, right? So I would hope that wasn't happening, but we all know that can. Uh, you know, one of the things I've also discussed with my clients is, you may not be on and I'll throw the names out, a Deltek, a Uninet, or some of these other systems. You're on QuickBooks, and the trying to do some of these things in Excel. I have to say, this is going to be definitely a recommendation for them to get on systems that have a lot more cost allocation and tracking built into it, because I can see this being a nightmare to try to manually figure out how all this is done through spreadsheets. So I'm gonna, obviously you're an attorney, you probably don't deal in the nuances that I do, but it just seems to me that's something that is going to be front and center.
Yeah, and frankly, there's a cost risk to that, right, for the customer or for the clients. So it's yeah, maybe you haven't switched over because you're worried about certain costs of these programs and these systems, but I can tell you if something happens, the costs of that system probably pale in comparison to the cost of what it's going to be to clean it up.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. The cost down the road is worse than the cost of doing it right now. Yeah, uh, I have those conversations all the time, but it's tough to get them to see that, because right, it's all about what I'm spending now. That opportunity cost is always tough to explain. Yeah, as a CPA, we get taught that in accounting 101, sunk cost, opportunity cost, cost benefit analysis. So, but we can only do our best. From a legal perspective, how are you best getting yourself out there, or wanting to get your information out? How can I help you in that?
We have most of our stuff. We have a COVID part of our webpage that we've been posting all of our information, including, frankly, all the guidance I was talking about. We're trying to put all of that up, unless there's some reason where it's sensitive. Like I think some of these NSA or CIA documents that excerpts were passed, it's just, I don't think they're making those public. But they're not classified or anything, but sensitive. So those things are not posting, but some of the more public stuff like the DoD, the OMB, all the like various either webinars that we did early on, blogs, all that kind of stuff is where we've been generally pointing people for the main guidance, and then just talking some of these things through, because like you said, they're not easy, and I get the frustration. I can tell some of our clients are extremely frustrated with just not knowing and the lack of guidance that's been put out. And unfortunately, it just is what it is to a certain extent, that they're setting this like May 7th deadline, or do I apply for PPP? The money's going to run out. I got to make a quick determination. And there's nothing out there
Right.
that's going to really cover you 100%.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, uncertainty seems to be the key, right? Not just with the pandemic itself and how things are going to be handled, and when do we go back to work, normal, or any of that. There's uncertainty in the guidelines around this. Uncertain is the key word. And our firm as well, SC&H, has put together, I have to say, a great team who've been putting information. We've done webinars. We've got our COVID-19 response team. We've got our website that has great resources. And I think it's been phenomenal, the outreach that both our respective firms have been doing and putting together. I've been asking you a lot of questions. Is there anything from your perspective that that we might have not discussed? And I know we've been trading emails that I might be able to lend.
I think the main thing I've been getting is kind of what we were talking about a little while ago, is this idea of, when am I going to have to give the money back? Or am I going to have to refund it? And what if I'm like a small business and all I do is firm fixed price work? It sounds like they're probably okay because they're not CAS covered or whatnot. But then also, well, what if I'm a small business and I do cost reimbursable work? And sort of the nuances of, is that definitely something that's going to come in the incurred cost submission, or is there other places where you see it?
Right. So, and I've been researching that. I've been talking with other resources, and right now, based on FAR clauses and things, that you would not expect them to have to give the credit back on an FFP, T&M, or even cost plus if they're not CAS covered. But I imagine that will change. I could see, either an added, probably not through FAR. I don't know how they're going to add it, but or DCAA taking a stance that you at least have to apply the refund and allocate it. And maybe you only have a couple cost plus contracts, so it's not going to be a huge impact, because then that credit would get allocated. I can't imagine them allocating the full credit to one or two contracts. So let's say you had $900,000 loan and you got it forgiven, and you've got a $100,000 contract. Well, you're not going to give back $900,000 on a $100,000 cost plus contract. So, yeah. But that is something that we will need to be researching and staying on top of. So that's why I think building modeled rates, benchmarking, having a system in place that you can do some modeling, forecasting without a lot of manual, doing it out of Excel, but having a system where you can plug and play and do some things. I know we've got a data analytics team, a government contracting team that work with some large firms, companies that help them with their modeling of the rates. And I think this is going to be even more important now than ever, to make sure they're on top of that. But, it is what it is. But we're definitely going to do a webinar on that, I would say, within the next 2 weeks. I'm hoping guidance will be out, maybe down the road if it's not, but it will be. The one thing is, companies are trying to do forecasting right now and figure things out, even though an incurred cost submission isn't due until June 30th of the following year. So we'd have till June 30, 2021 for calendar year 2020. We're definitely going to need to be in front of this well before those submissions are going to be due. But I would think, just from a cash flow perspective and forecasting, they need to be on this, sooner rather than later.
Do you think people should change their interim rates if they get the forgiveness in a few weeks? I guess it depends on the company, if you're willing to just pay a big tranche back later versus changing your interim rates now and maybe giving back too much and then getting a credit back from the government. Do you have any recommendations on that, or just kind of company by company?
Yeah, here's my thoughts. I mean, if you were eligible and you had a need, and it becomes less problematic if you're not refunding the money back to the government, right? I mean, that's the issue, is what are you refunding, and if anything. So my thoughts are, try your best to keep people employed, do what you can. But at the end of the day, if it's not forgiven, you're going to pay a low rate. So it's going to be a balancing act. That's the thing. You already have provisional rates for this year. So if you have cost plus, you're already billing at a rate. You're not, unless you want to go to your contracting officer and say, hey, we're going to adjust our rates, but I don't see how that works. So yeah, that's where it's going to be very difficult. I really don't think there's a wrong or right answer. It's a depends. But I can't see changing my interim rates right now, because I don't know what they're going to look like, because I don't know what the forgiveness may or may not look like. That's why it's tough to forecast rates in this environment. Normally you have certainty, but how can you forecast uncertainty? So yeah, That's probably about the best non-answer I can give.
No, that makes sense. And I think that just goes with what people are saying. They're
Yeah.
looking for certainty in a very uncertain situation.
Yeah. So we can only just provide them as best guidance we can, I think is all we can do. Well, listen, I know we're hitting a hard stop. Again, Cy, thank you so much for being able to participate. I know it was short notice, but obviously this is very important to your clients, my clients, and frankly, the government industry, government contracting industry as a whole. We'll be sharing this obviously through our website and social media, and hope you do the same. And our contact information, mine and yours, as well as our firms, will be available. So I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Be safe.
You too.